Welcome to Commander Central episode 223, and today we're going to be talking about art in Magic the Gathering with Fantasy Illustrator and community member Aaron Radney. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
Gentlemen, how's it going today?
Pretty great. It's a Friday afternoon, and I'm looking forward to the weekend.
It's actually going to be nice out this weekend, too, hopefully.
Seems like it's supposed to be, so I can get a few last-minute outdoor tasks done. We'll have Aaron on here in a little bit after we get our usual business taken care of. But first, we haven't really done a Games We Played segment in a little bit, just because we haven't been playing that many games. But Max actually got some in with a brand new deck I think he wanted to talk about a little bit.
I did. I got to finally take my new Psi Master Thopterist clone and drones deck out for a spin a few times this week. You know, I'd been goldfishing, and it's really hard to goldfish a clone deck because you have nothing to clone. Sure. Except your own stuff.
Right.
So I got to play 2 games with it the other day, and it was a lot of fun. The deck plays in a way where the first game I saw most of the artifact synergies, and the second game I saw most of the clone synergies.
Oh, nice.
An interesting thing happened, though. I learned I can't read cards, first off, which happens a lot, I guess. Because I was trying to dig for a counterspell with a Mystic Forge top combo, and I had a reducer out, so I could just loop it.
Sure.
What I forgot, though, is that the draw trigger on Kindred Discovery, when I set it to Thopters, is not a May for the Enter the Battlefield trigger.
Oh, yes. Yes, it is not.
So I technically milled myself out like 15 cards earlier when I actually did it. And this whole time, I was looking for a 4th counterspell to stop the game-ending play by the other player, only to realize I don't have a 4th one in there, and Narset's Reversal doesn't counter enchantments.
So you just, like, if there was a way to make that misplay, you made every possible permutation of screwing that up, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. From not knowing a brand new deck to not reading my cards and then flooding the boards with, 50-some Thopters was a lot of fun, though.
Cool. And this was kind of a Borderlands-themed deck, at least a little bit, right?
Yes, it is. I had the commander altered to be my main character from Borderlands who makes clones and drones, so...
Nice.
It's pretty cool. I'm really enjoying how it plays, and I feel like I have to keep the clone aspect because I could really see this deck getting super scumbaggy if I don't.
Well, that is your Scumbags Unite, so, you got to maintain a little bit of the rep. How about you, Chris? Have you got any games in or anything at all?
I
guess
wish.
not, but...
Yeah, I've tried to go down and hit up the shop on a Tuesday and only like 3 or 4 people show up, and I'm just like, okay, I'm going to go home then.
It's a lousy time of year, too, because college just kicked back in, which then jacked up the amount of corona cases in town here because there's 20,000 students flooding back in who aren't necessarily the most cautious either. So yeah,
we take all precautions though. I mean, we sit far enough apart, we have masks on, we do all the stuff we're supposed to. It's just no one wants to come out and risk it. So
I actually stopped in the shop on last Friday and picked up a pre-release kit, which you feel bad not getting to go to do pre-releases and that kind of stuff anyway. And as if to rub salt in the wound, of the 6 packs I cracked open from the pre-release, there were 3 Lotus Cobras.
Holy crap.
You would have won that draft.
Man, what a ridiculous deck I could have built with Lotus. I had 3 Lotus Cobras and 3 of the black removal spell that hits enchantments. I forget what it's called. The new one anyway. So I'm like, man, 3 really nice pieces of removal and 3 Lotus Cobras. I could have built a pretty solid 40 card deck out of that.
Right.
Like just those 6 cards. So that was kind of a bit of a downer as well, but whatever. I will survive and take solace in the fact that I now have 3 Lotus Cobras. So if you out there in listener land would like to reach out to us and say hello or tell us about any fun games you played, how would you go about doing that, Chris?
Well, you can reach us on the multitude of social media platforms that we're located at. So we'll start off with the Twitter birds, where you can find us at CMDR Central. You can also find us on Facebook by searching CMDR Central, and you can find us online at cmdrcentral.com.
You can also head over to patreon.com and check out our reward tiers. If you're so inclined to support us financially, we thank each and every one of you that do currently support us, and anybody new that will come our way. And we have to say thank you and hello to 2 new patrons this week: Timothy Dwayne Andrews the second, and then Jason Belk.
Well, Timothy and Jason, thank you much for supporting the show. We really appreciate it. And if all you can do is support the show by clicking like or upvoting us on whatever platform you use to listen, that means a lot too. Any support you can give us in whatever way you can do it, that's a big deal. So thank you very much. I think we have a Twitter giveaway going this month as well, Max.
We do indeed. We are giving away a copy of the Magic the Gathering book, The Gathering Dark. It's the Ice Age Cycle Book 1 by Jeff Grubb. Go find that tweet on our Twitter timeline, and as long as you retweet and follow us, you'll be entered to win the book.
All right. So before we jump in here with Aaron, we're getting fairly close to Commander Legends. When the show comes out, I think we're only going to be a week or two away from previews starting for that. So we haven't really talked about it too much. There's going to be a ton of new cards in there and a ton of reprints. I just wanted to ask you guys before we actually start seeing stuff, is there anything you're really hoping specifically to see show up as a reprint, for example? For me, I'm always looking for like new foils. So there's a couple of different cards that have never had a foil, whether it's commander only stuff like Darksteel Mutation or Song of the Dryads. It'd be nice to get those in foil as well. Old stuff like Nature's Lore's never had a foil. So that's, for me personally, I'm like always looking for that. But there's a few old cards that have gotten a little bit pricey too. Mystic Remora is gotten expensive, and it doesn't have a foil.
You deserve that, 100%.
So that would be a great one to see show up. There's a few portal cards, like 3 visits would be nice to see, just because they're really expensive for people to pick them up as well. Chris, anything you'd like to see show up as a reprint here?
Honestly, if I had to choose, I would like to see Command Tower show up in foil again.
Sure.
Just so it's a little bit more accessible for people to get their hands on.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's
I don't think
pricey
Command
right
Tower, I don't think in foil it should be that expensive because it is a strictly commander card. So there should be multitudes of it so people can bling out their decks with a card that everyone has already.
I'm with you there. Anything for you, Max?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat as you, Dana. I'm just looking for foils of cards that were previously printed in sets that didn't have foils. So like Active Authority or even Thought Vessel would be great to have foils of finally.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with that. I'm also looking forward to none of us are super huge lore people, but we kind of have a familiarity with the Magic storyline over the years to a degree, and they've been doing a nice job the last few years going back to old characters like, hey, here's a Gerard card that's finally not terrible and things like that. So I'm really curious to see what we wind up getting for old lore characters too. That's always a lot of fun. We know we're getting Baron Sangir, so that's amazing, but there's a lot of cool stuff they could revisit, and I'm actually really kind of hyped about that as well. Like, in addition to just cool new cards, including the other half of the Battle Bond lands, which is a big deal. It's just going to be fun to see, like, oh, we got a new version of Autumn Willow that isn't awful, or like just random stuff like that. I think this is going to be a super fun set. I'm really excited just to see all of it, and I just hope it's available next year when like it's much easier to meet face to face and do drafts. Because that is a super cool thing I want to do with it too, and I just hope that there's enough copies of this out there that people can get, because that's been a weird thing right now. Double Masters was tough to find. Jumpstart's been super tough to find. Even Zendikar Rising right now is looking like there's been a delay in a lot of this stuff. So I
have insider information on that one.
I know our shop was definitely getting less product than they had hoped they were getting.
Yep, it's all your big WPN stores are getting their full allocations, and then your big box stores are. And for some reason, Wizards and the distributors are leaving out the little stores.
Oh, that's brutal. The little stores who are already hurting the most.
Yep.
Yeah, it's not great.
Dana, you just mentioned being able to draft Commander Legends hopefully next year once, things have gotten out of quarantine. I do know that the Commander Social guys are going to be doing a virtual, sealed league with that. So you'll buy a few packs and then add to it every week. And I think you can hear more about that next week on their episode where we all talk about that.
I was just going to say, because you recorded with them, so this show will air on Monday, and I believe the Wednesday show, so 2 days from now for Commander Social, will be the show where you are guesting there talking about that, correct?
Correct. And you get to see my pretty face on YouTube, too.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Well, everyone, make sure you tune in and listen to hear what Max has to say about that, and it's generally a good show anyway. Ryan and Zach do a good job, so they're worth checking out, even if Max isn't there, but when Max is there, it's that much better, right?
It's definitely worth it then.
All right, okay. All right, for our main topic today, we're going to be talking about the art of Magic the Gathering, and I'd like to welcome aboard Fantasy Illustrator Aaron Radney to the show. Aaron, welcome aboard here.
Thank you, guys. I'm happy to be here. This is, I'm going to steal an old radio line. Long-time listener, first time on the show. Really excited for this, so let's do this.
Well, we're
I have
glad to
not
have you
heard
on.
that in a long time.
I was having that conversation with my wife the other day about like trying to figure out if people still, I mean, clearly people still listen to radio, but I certainly am not one of them anymore.
I do in my garage when I'm working. Other than that, not really.
Yeah.
Nowhere near as much as I used to on my end either.
Yeah, unless I'm running like down the block, I'm not going to take the time to sync my phone to my car and turn
Right.
on, Spotify.
Well, because you're kind of your own best DJ when you have access to, basically every song, straight to your perfect radio station. Anyway, we're going way far afield here.
It's still art. It's the art of being a DJ.
You know what? You are correct. And Aaron, we kind of have met on Twitter. We started talking, I don't know, 6 months, a year ago, interacting. And then I got to play a couple of games with you on stream on the EDH Recast this summer at some point anyway.
Some point in the summer, yeah. That was a good time.
Yeah, that was a real good time. We'll have to see if we can get some games in here again at some point in the near future. We're actually just talking about, we need to pick up Chris a webcam, because he doesn't have one currently, to play games as well, so we can get him online and playing a few matches. So we'll have to figure something out here at some point in the near future.
Agreed. I'm in the middle of trying to get my own webcam, so I don't have to use my phone anymore.
Well, and that was part of the problem too, is because once everyone started working from home and like going to school from home, getting a webcam became a big deal. And they're just starting to get more back in stock on Amazon. So it was tough to find one there for a long time. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself here? You can let everyone know where they can find your work online if they want to take a look, or I know you're taking commissions for work as well. Why don't you plug yourself here before we get started? All
right. So, again, my name is Aaron Radney. You can find me mostly under my name all over the place. You can find me on Twitter at Aaron_Radney. That's AARON_RADNEY. You can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Aaron Radney. You can find me on my website at www.aaronradney.com. I try to make it as easy as possible. So there is that. As you guys noted, I'm a fantasy illustrator. I went to a school that is going to be closing soon, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah, I went to Memphis College of Art in Memphis, Tennessee, and
Nice.
While I enjoyed my time there, I actually find this kind of funny. You know all those stories about how like the famous artist, this great artist, was a not particularly good student.
Sure.
That
Sure.
cliche. I was the opposite. I was a very good student. I was a straight A student, salutatorian in high school, but I didn't want to go on to any of the other things people were trying to force me into. I wanted to go into art. And I personally think that for the 4 years I was at Memphis College of Art, I was not a great art student because I hadn't quite learned how to adapt my good student normal school habits to art school. I had to kind of get through the education there, figure out what didn't work for me. And then I've spent the last 8 years since I graduated school, basically giving myself all the training that I kind of neglected when I was in school.
Sure. I get that.
Like, I was overconfident in thinking that, if I just followed everything the teachers told me like I did in normal school, I'd be fine. Training in art is a little bit different than that. There's a little bit different mentality that you need, and it took me a while to learn that.
I've kind of had that conversation with my son a little bit about, because he's been doing a lot of writing lately, like fiction writing, creative writing kind of stuff. And that transition from, of course, when you're young and just first, learning to do that kind of thing, and you're not following like the rules of grammar and the rules of sentence structure and paragraph structure and, how to craft a story and how to develop characters, you have to learn how to do those things the right way. But the next, and that's something most people eventually figure out, but the next step to evolve past that is to learn how to not do those things. And that's where it gets really tricky. Like, it's one thing to learn the kind of quote unquote rules. It's another thing entirely to learn how to break those rules in an effective way. And that's and he's been kind of working on that, because at some point, I've introduced him a little bit to like Cormac McCarthy and writers like that who, McCarthy, who just ignores the use of punctuation entirely and will write, 700 word paragraphs. But like, as a writer, he can make that work. That's a really challenging thing to understand, how you can make that, bad at using rules, good at using rules. And the next level is to, again, not care about the rules.
Right. My issue was that there was a whole bunch of stuff that I should have been doing or that I wanted to be working on in my practice that I was not.
Okay.
Because I was so like laser focused on a couple of things. I didn't really pay attention to my fundamentals and foundation the way I should have. But it was also that I didn't click with some of the ways that teachers were trying to encourage that. And I didn't understand why some of these things needed to be done the way that we were being told they were, because that just didn't work for me.
Okay.
So I had to learn a lot of what didn't work first. And one of the best lessons that I got in school was actually on my last day of college. My illustration professor pulled me aside when I was explaining to him how badly I felt about what I'd done, because my portfolio was not ready when I got out of college. It was not professional level. I was not very good. And he told me, art school is not designed to make you a master in 4 years. You can't do it and expect someone to have a long career. They'll burn out.
Sure.
And that was the mistake that I made. When I was in college, I thought that art school was going to make me a master. That was not what the goal of art school is. Art school, at best, is your apprenticeship in like the old apprentice, journeyman, master system.
Sure.
Art school is designed at best to make you a competent journeyman. It is not going to turn you into a master in just those 4 years. And that's part of why I had to retool my thinking, because I'd gone through the entirety of art school with the wrong mentality.
Well, sure. And then you probably get frustrated that you aren't making these leaps that you thought you were going to make.
Exactly.
Which is then kind of a feedback loop as well. Sure, that makes sense.
So after that, I started really working on developing my fundamentals, getting the skills that I now understood after spending some time to think about it, what the school was trying to teach me, and then retooling that with the learning methods that I knew worked for me and go, okay, this is what I'm trying to learn. How do I get there? And so I spent the first 6 months or so after I got out of college, getting up, drawing for 8 to 10 hours, passing out, and doing that again every single day.
Oof.
I mean, it's a physical activity like anything else, and you just need to put in the hours.
Oh, yeah. But the thing that really got me was there was a job that I picked up, small job, really small amount of money, but it was for a company that I still work with now occasionally. And that kind of shifted my thinking and my way of making art, because it was also for a while where I always knew I wanted to do fantasy. I was part of a small little clique in my illustration class where that was our focus. The whole class broke down in a whole bunch of really interesting ways. You had the comics folks, you had the people who wanted to do editorial, which is like newspapers and magazines. Then you had those of us who wanted to do like fantasy and genre stuff.
Okay.
And so we were all in the same program, but you all had these like little cliques of what people were working on. It was fascinating to see. But I was getting bored with a lot of the fantasy that I was doing, and I wasn't making any headway. I wasn't improving. And then I got this job that wanted me to do a story that was inspired by African history and various cultures in Africa. I'm so mad at myself that I cannot remember the specific culture the story was pulling from, but I did that project. It was for a black and white interior, and I loved it. And it shifted the entire way I do things. And if you look at my work, and this is something that I know was one of the reasons that we ended up connected, Dana, was my work is very centered on non-Eurocentric stories. So much of fantasy borrows from Western Europe and maybe a little bit from East Asia, but there's a whole bunch of the rest of the world. And most of my work centers on that kind of thing, the groups that are not typically highlighted in fantasy. And once I realized that was something I wanted to do, not only did my work get better, it got easier to do, and I just started having a ton more fun.
Well, I suppose, too, that then you get a personal connection to a degree, and something, it then feels like you've found an in, I guess, might be the way, or a hook.
Exactly. That's the exact way of putting it.
I completely get that. So how would you describe kind of your personal style, or what you work on now, or are there any particular influences you have that might speak to what you're trying to do?
Definitely. That full list is a little too long to go into, but I really like Baroque period painting, the drama and the harsh shadows and the very distinct lighting that goes into that particular period in art history. I adore that. I've got a lot of the same influences that a lot of people have in my field, as far as people like N.C. Wyeth, who is a very famous illustrator. If you put his name in and look him up, he's great. There's one that I have that a lot of people don't. His name is Howard Pyle. He's kind of known as the godfather of American illustration. If you ever wondered why like certain pieces look more cinematic than others, he was kind of the guy who figured that out. Old illustration looked like it was kind of on like a play stage or a theater stage. He was the guy who started doing dynamic camera angles. He was the one who started doing all these things of figuring out that if you change the way people are looking at an image, you can up your storytelling.
Okay.
So those are some of the ones that I really enjoy. And then there's people like Michael Wellen, who he did a lot of the stuff for the Dragon Riders of Pern books by Anne McCaffrey. There are people like Dan Dos Santos is another guy whose work I really like. He's got great lighting, great color work. He's one of the people who I really enjoy looking at his work. He did the covers for most of the Mercy Thompson books by Patricia Briggs.
How about among Magic artists? Is there anybody that really like speaks to you or jumps out at you as somebody that you like a lot?
Okay, so like a lot of artists, I really like Rebecca Gay, but she doesn't really influence my work a ton.
Sure.
I just love her because she's different.
I suppose her style probably would be tough to take much influence from without looking like you're aping her style.
Exactly. But as far as more modern folks, I've been getting really interested in... I've been a fan of Peter Moorbacher for years. There's Jason Rainville, who I think is fantastic and is also just kind of a fantastic guy to talk to. There's Ryan Pancoast, who, going back to our game, he did the art for Tetsuko Umezawa Fugitive, who was the commander I played in that game.
Which is a great, cool piece of art, too.
Yes, it is. It's really good. Yeah, those are some of the ones. There was a period when Jason Chan was very clearly influencing a lot. And I can't remember if Clint Clearly was a guy who's ever done magic art or not, but he's kind of working in the same vein, which is what's called magical realism, which is what I'm always aiming for, which is kind of the name for the official style that Magic typically uses.
Okay.
He has done magic art.
There we go. So I get to count that one.
Interesting. A lot of these people that you named off, I have no clue unless you say what the card is, who they are. So I'm going to be completely honest.
No, that's entirely fair. So Ryan Pancoast, let's go with Tetsuko. Jason Rainville, you probably know best from Uldrotha.
Okay.
Clint Clearly, again, I can't say you off the top of my head. The immediate Jason Chan piece that comes to mind for me is Bloodline Keeper.
Okay, which is really nice, which is a really good looking piece of art.
Clint did Breya. That'd be one of his big pieces.
And, that makes sense. The way Bray is painted very clearly has elements of his color use.
That is
He's done a few other ones, but that's the first one I know that all three of us would know.
Yep. Okay. Well, something, too, for the listeners. So, because then they hear the names of an artist. And,
right.
Some people like me who just don't, know the artist names off the top of their head like that and be like, oh, I know that card. That's a really nice art. I like that. And, something we can, show the listeners too exactly who we're talking about.
Exactly. That was actually one of my fears was I don't know how quickly people are going to be able to pull up some of the images we're talking about.
We'll have to see if we can maybe get a few of them up on the YouTube channel for information as well here.
So we received some questions from our Patreon supporters, and we're going to start off with a question from Jim Dean. Jim is wondering about your preferred method for creating art. An example, do you tend to favor traditional sketches and paintings, digital painting with, like touchscreen or tablet, or a combination of both?
So I really like to do a combination of both when I can. Most of my painting is done digitally, and a lot more of the drawing has been done digitally lately just for the sake of time. But I love doing my sketches traditionally in my sketchbook. I love working on what's called toned paper, which is usually, in my case, brown paper. Because one of the things that I'm very bad at, and my patrons, I talk about this all the time, and I've talked about this on my Twitter a few times. I am very bad at solving light and color at the same time. Like, art is all about problem solving.
Yep.
And I have a real hard time solving lighting and color at the same time. So I will use toned paper to the point where I can work shadows and light at that stage. And then when I move to the digital, I kind of have a roadmap for where the light is supposed to go. And then I can figure out the color on top of that. That's a method I kind of stole from Clint because he had a whole video about how he did that. But usually what I'll do is I will draw out whatever I want. And these will be messy sketches. These will not be anything that is very clear to anybody but me.
Okay.
And I will scan those in, bring those into Photoshop or something, and then I'll paint digitally using the tablet as if it was just another canvas. These days, I don't even remove the line art layer anymore. A lot of artists will remove the line art layer. I just paint on top of it as if it was a canvas, and I just paint entirely over all of my line work at the end. It's just a skeleton that I'm building the piece on top of.
Interesting. So this is personally coming from me. We have an event here where we live in Eau Claire called Chalk Fest. And it happens every year. And I'm curious, is that something that you've ever done? You just go out on the concrete, take out some chalk, and just go to town?
I've not done that since I was a kid. Part of me kind of misses it, but I am bad at chalk and pastels. Like, I am real bad at those.
It's actually, though, seriously crazy considering, that this town isn't that big. It's 60,000 or so people, but there's usually 500 to 700 entries where they like block off individual squares of the sidewalk. And some of them are insanely good that people have like one day to just work on.
Oh yeah.
It is something to see. It's nuts, especially since chalk is such a limited medium, and you're working in the hot, like just the worst conditions too with a terrible medium. And yeah, it's real impressive to see.
So yeah, I have nothing but respect for the artists that can do things in chalk, because I cannot. The other things I like doing watercolor. I don't get as much time to do them as I used to, or as much as I'd like. But the other medium that I've messed with that is fun, but again, I don't do very often, is called Scratchboard. It's this black piece of clay, basically. Or I should say it's a piece of white clay with a black paint covering. And it's kind of like etching. You scratch away the black to reveal what kind of image you want to make. And it is a challenging medium because it's very unforgiving. Like, if you make a mistake, it's there.
You're not getting away from it.
No, you have to try to make it work at that point.
Interesting. So follow up from Jim. He's curious about how often a particular medium or method is requested by a person who ends up hiring you.
Almost never, actually. People tend to pick you for what you do and what you show off, matching what they need, rather than finding somebody and go, hey, I want you to do this thing this way.
Interesting.
Okay. Yeah, it's super interesting. It's kind of like, why would you hire someone and make them learn a new skill or try something they've never done before?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I could see it where a person sees your art, per se, and they like it, and they're like, can you do that, say, in a watercolor, like you were discussing or something like that? I want exactly how you, draw something or how you sketch something. I want that style you have, but can you do that in a watercolor? That's how I would approach an artist, because it's like my preferred, I like the look of watercolor over, regular paint type of deal.
And that kind of thing does happen, but it hasn't really ever happened with me.
Okay.
So our next question comes from patron supporter Tatum. She says, art in Magic has sort of trended towards a sort of fantasy realism.
Right.
What do you think about pieces like Enter the Infinite or Bedevil that depart from reality as a deliberate stylistic choice?
So I love those. Like, as much as I am pushing in that fantasy realism, or what's called magical realism direction, there is a particular kind of creativity that I love in seeing pieces like that are far more abstract. And I think that both are desperately important as part of a balanced artistic diet.
Sure.
Yeah.
Bedevil is a Seb McKinnon piece, and Seb McKinnon is kind of the golden boy for that now.
Yes. He's the big popular guy right now.
And it's interesting because they very clearly have like a style guide, style book, whatever it would wind up being, where they're trying to get a kind of coherent art look for an individual set or even the game as a whole. Except for Seth McKinnon, they're like, yeah, whatever, do whatever you want.
Oh yeah, like there is a level of good where you can just get people to go, you know what, you do you.
Right.
But that's kind of the thing. Like, that's why they hire him. When they want some kind of contrast in a set, they give him a call or send him an email and it's like, hey, we want you on this, specifically because that kind of thing helps the feel of the game. Getting all those different artists, I think, makes the game better. And I also love that they've been doing this thing lately with like the showcase frames and everything, where they have been kind of departing a little bit from the house style.
Yeah, that definitely, as they've experimented even with the weird showcase frames, especially, they've let them totally change up the art style in addition to just the frame. So like, we've kind of gradually moved from, okay, now we'll see some different frames with showcase cards to, well, if we're going to do different frames, we'll just let the artistic style of the actual pieces be a radical departure from what we usually see as well.
Yeah, like the thing that immediately jumps to my mind are the comic art altars from Korea.
Yeah, which look amazing.
And even 5 years ago, you would have never seen that in Magic. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, which is funny, because like in the early days, you did have quite a bit of departure. You went from, Shivam Dragon is a very kind of comic book style art on that dragon to some really photoreal stuff, like I think Elves of Deep Shadow jumped to mind.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Stasis, which just doesn't look like anything that makes sense at all with a piece of
No.
magic art, but it's a great piece of art. So they had a very disparate amount of different styles early on, and they kind of moved to keeping things really, really uniform. And now they seem to be much more open now to once again going to a really diverse spread of what they want to show or willing to show.
And sometimes it'll even be between sets, they kind of change up the way they do things. Like one of the really obvious ones, when you look at the contrast between them, is Mirrodin and New Phyrexia versus Innistrad, because those two came out so close together.
Right.
One of the things the art directors on that did, and I read this back on one of the old Wizard sites, when they were hiring for New Phyrexia, they leaned toward their digital painters. They wanted that kind of harsher, more mechanical, almost like sometimes when you're doing digital painting, things can look a little plastic if you're not careful.
Sure.
And they wanted that look for New Phyrexia. But when they got to Innistrad, they started leaning on their traditional painters. So they started calling their oil guys. They started calling their acrylic guys.
Okay.
And that changes the look. And you can see markedly different looks in Innistrad and New Phyrexia because of that.
It's very interesting.
Do you think, as they kind of push the boundaries of art on these showcase cards, the comic book style from Ikoria, the travel voucher brochures that we got with Zendikar Rising, do you think they'll eventually try pushing the limits to maybe more like a CGI, Pixar-ish 3D style for some of these more chasing cards?
I don't see why they wouldn't at least try it. There are already artists, several of them, where they use 3D modeling programs as part of their process for putting together a piece, just because there are sometimes backgrounds that are really complicated where on a tight deadline you don't have time to really prep everything out, but a 3D program makes that easy to do. One of the cards that is really that actually did this is the Nyssa Steward of Elements, I believe, from the Amonkhet block.
Gotcha.
The background in that was originally a 3D model that the artist ended up painting over.
Oh, okay. Sure, that makes sense. I can see it. I'm looking at the piece right now, and I never would have thought that, but like you can kind of, as you say it, I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense looking at the piece.
Yeah, there's actually a really good video somewhere. If you want to, if your audience wants to go looking for it, I really recommend watching it, because watching that guy paint that after laying in everything is kind of amazing.
Discussing artistic style, this was a little bit more of a trick thing, but like I always find scale and how artists try to show scale in a piece to be interesting. And the one example I always think of is the original Progenitus art,
which is a great piece. It's a great example for that.
And you don't, because you don't even see anything. All you see is the shadow of Progenitus in the distance in the clouds. That was a piece when I first came back to Magic, saw the card. I think it was in Duel of the Planeswalkers is where I saw it, but wherever it was, I just remember just looking at it, just looking at that piece and the way it made me feel, that to me has always felt way more Lovecraftian than the stuff we got in Zendikar originally that was, the Eldrazi based on Lovecraft stuff. That one has always been to me the most disconcerting in terms of that's just this mammoth unknowable monster in the distance that's going to end all reality, and the scale of it is done so well that it's just really, really striking. Are there any pieces to you that really jump out where the artist is doing a trick, whether it's to scale or really anything that you really enjoy? I know we had a recent one you and I talked about briefly a week or two ago where you liked the angle with some hedrons. Right. So can you go into that a little bit here?
Definitely. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about the tricks that get used in Progenitus and how that gets done in scale, and then I'm going to gush real quick about the card you're talking about. It's called Nahiri's
Sure.
Binding, so we're going to get into that in just a second. So one of the things as far as scale goes is there are, in my opinion, a couple of ways of making something look big. One of them is showing other objects that we have a general idea about what their size is, to go, oh, that is that much bigger than that thing, whose size I know. That thing must be enormous. That is one trick. And you'll see this in things like scale birds. If you look at cards like, I believe the original Nylea, God of the Hunt.
Okay, yep.
Uses that
Sure.
trick. But Progenitus is actually doing something different, and it's the method I prefer, because it gets into the thing you talked about there of how you felt when you looked at it. Progenitus, you've got nothing there really for scale outside of what's in the foreground to you, so you know that is absolutely massive. Progenitus makes you feel small.
Yeah.
That's
a great way to word it.
That's the trick here. And some of this is done in a couple of different ways. With Progenitus, the horizon line is very low. So what this does is it raises your eye up. So you're looking kind of down on the image. The idea is that you are in the sky looking at this. The camera of the image, the metaphorical camera, is in the sky. And that bright light changes where your eye is. So the eye line in this and the horizon line are slightly different. But because you have to look down and you are so far away, you have this feeling of the sky being massive in the image, which again helps make you feel smaller. It emphasizes the distance and the amount of space the sky is taking up. The other thing about the way Progenitus does this is it's up in the clouds, and you know in your mind just how high clouds are. And it is Lovecraftian in this way of it's hard to see. It's not entirely clear. Your brain is adding stuff. And that's part of what makes it so scary. It's that same principle in horror movies of why you almost never see the monster till the end.
Right, because the unknown is always more terrifying than the known.
Right. Now, a similar effect coming from the other angle, like you're up in the sky with Progenitus. The one that I like that does this whole make me feel small is Thassa Deep Dwelling from the latest Theros set. Thassa is very clearly large in this, and all the gods are, but it doesn't always feel that way to me, at least.
Right.
Thassa, meanwhile, if I'm looking at a picture of a god, I want to feel like, oh, this thing could end me. This is a god compared to a mortal. That's how I want to feel when I look at this. And of the gods, Thassa really is the only one in this batch that seems to do it for me, because we are so low compared to her in this. In the way the camera is set up, we are a good distance away, and you've got that sky pushing down on the bottom of the image, because there's just so much sky in that. And that line of her spear actually forces your eye down into the water to kind of force you then to look back up at her. It gives you this feeling of you are a small thing in like that ship that's really small in the image, forced to look up at this awe-inspiring image of the god of the oceans. But you don't get that same feeling, for me at least, in the original Thassa, where we're kind of looking at her more straight on.
Sure. Or even in the showcase version of it is the same thing.
Yeah.
It's a cool looking picture, but there's no scale at all. You don't get that vibe at all about her size or power.
Exactly. And so that's my thing is if you're going to make something look big, you want to make the other people or the person looking at it feel small. Sometimes that's more important than making something look obviously huge, is how do you make the viewer feel? Because if they feel small, even an average person is going to look way larger.
Very, very cool. And what was the Nahiri card you had just mentioned?
Right. Too? Nahiri's Binding by Magali Villanueva, I think is how you pronounce that. So this is, again, one of those really inside baseball things, but I love composition. Composition is how you lay the pieces of an image on it. And you can use composition to tell a story. And this thing is such a great storytelling moment. It makes sense. It's a story spotlight card. You've got Nahiri manipulating all this stone. She's in the air. Jace is very clearly trapped in this like circle of hedrons pointing at him. He's reaching up toward her. This feels so much like, in some ways, a Saturday morning cartoon where the villain has got the hero in their clutches. It evokes that same energy, and it's so good at doing it, and that is almost done entirely by the composition here. And again, audience, forgive me, I'm going to gush about a whole bunch of stuff that is really artistic inside baseball, but I don't care because this is just that good. So the first thing you have is the power imbalance. The higher up on an image something is, usually the more power it has. That's another one of those ways of making things feel, one thing or another, feel small. Nahiri is obviously smaller than Jace here because she's up higher. That's a perspective thing. But she clearly has all the power in this moment because of how much higher she is. We are forced to look up to her. She has the high ground.
It's as Obi-Wan Kenobi tells Anakin, I have the high ground.
Exactly. And that's exactly what's going on here. That's how we know Nahiri's winning this in this moment. We also know this is what's called an aggressive composition. If you're interested in art and you want to learn more about composition, there's a book called How Pictures Work by Molly Bang, which uses simple shapes to really explain how composition works. But one of the things about this is what's known as an aggressive composition, or at least that's what we called it when I was in school. You know that one party is actively aggressing against another because all those hedrons act as points. They are pointing your eye at Jace, but they are sharp, and it evokes this feeling in you of, oh, that's going to hurt me. And thus, it's going to hurt this character. So that's how we know, that's one of the ways we know Jason's in trouble. If you knew nothing about Magic's story, if you knew nothing about the characters involved here or how Magic worked at all, looking at this, you would immediately know the character on the pillar is more powerful than the one on the ground. She is the one winning this conflict, and it is a serious conflict because she has all these stones that are under her control. And it is such a basic application of this trick because it forces our eye to Jace. His hand leads us to Nahiri, who is clearly the one in charge. The electrical energy or the magical energy she's using to manipulate the Hedrons leads us back around, and it keeps our eye invested in looking at everything in the piece. It is such a basic application of the fundamentals, but it is such a good basic application of the fundamentals that it's kind of elevated. And I just adore the way this one is set up. Like, this is probably my favorite piece out of everything in Zendikar Rising, just because I know all the little tricks that went into putting it together.
It's just fascinating that on a common, the artists don't care. They have no idea what they're just making their piece.
Oh yeah. And this is a masterclass in visual storytelling, which is the whole point of illustration. Like, you get so much from this if you know what you're looking at. And even if you don't, it immediately gives you that feeling that, would very clearly convey the point of the story. We get so much about these characters from this.
This one comes from Patreon supporter Thor. Thor has wondered this for a while now, but does Wizards of the Coast own the art on the card, or does the artist retain the art? And if it's not too inside baseball, why do they change the art for certain cards for different sets? An example would be like Kiki Jiki being chase art for some people.
All right, so this is one that's going to be a little harder for me to answer because the main thing is I am not sure. I am still trying to get to a point where I get a card painted for Wizards. I have not gotten to that place yet. So, like, full disclosure, I don't know this for certain, but based on the conversations I've had with other artists who work with Wizards, I'm going to give you my best guess. They would be the ones to ask for hard, correct information. My guess, based on everything I've seen, is that Wizards does not specifically own the art for whatever card they're buying. They are buying what are called usage rights. So they have the right to use it for Magic and things. I would be willing to bet, based on the way Wizards works, that this is what's called exclusive use rights. So the company are the only ones who have the right to use that art for a game. Like, an artist can't sell that art to another game or another game company, as far as I understand. But they still have the right to use it in their portfolio. They still have the right to use it for conventions, to sell prints and all these things. Wizards doesn't want to touch the print market or anything like that.
Okay, that would make sense. Yeah, when we go to like a GP or something like that, the artists have their, original prints, and they have playmats made up and all that of the art that they've done so they can sell it.
Right. So that kind of is my thinking on that, which also plays into that question of why do Wizards seem to reprint cards with different art all the time? A part of that is because depending on how their contracts are set up, they might have to pay that artist again for the use of that same art on another card. And depending on how they have things set up, it might just be cheaper to hire another artist to paint a new piece. Then there's wanting to try to match things to various themes of releases. And so there are all kinds of factors that could explain why that happens. I don't know the exact ones or things that are kind of more standard, but that would be my guess.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, it does to me as well. And I'll here's another real world example where that is an issue. 30 years ago or so, when like a TV show, in particular, this was an issue with TV shows, would like license a piece of music or something to use on the air, they would, pay the artist, hey, we're going to, give you X amount of dollars to use this song on this TV show. And that was where the contract ended. And then once the age of DVD occurred, that was no longer covered. So like, when a show went to try to sell DVD versions of something, they would oftentimes have to then repay that artist to reuse that song, or just change it entirely if the artist would no longer give them rights or could no longer give it for whatever reason. So that was, I remember, once upon a time a big deal. Whereas I would wager nowadays, when a TV show goes to use a piece of music, the contract is set up that we can reuse this in any future form of the show that we then air, whether it's on DVD or streaming or some some magical future format. I would guess the same thing occurred with art, where once upon a time they're like, hey, we're going to print this piece of art. Here's, how much we're paying you, without thinking about the long-term ramifications of reusing that art down the road.
Which is a distinct possibility. It said, I can't say for certain, but those are my guesses based on some of the conversations that I've had or some of the things that I've read.
So this next question is from Jagner, and he says he loves hearing what or where artists get their inspirations from, generally or specifically for a certain piece of art. Do you have any interesting stories about the inspirations for things that you've done in your portfolio?
Oh, yeah. Again, I talked about this earlier. That one job that I did for a company called MV Media, which is a Black speculative fiction outlet, that pushed me to doing more art that would be qualified as Black speculative fiction. And I really enjoyed pulling stuff from African history, specifically West African history, and using those kinds of things to influence a lot of my work. Last year, when I was working on one of my own personal fantasy worlds, I was drawing a lot from the Kingdom of Mali, which is a ancient West African kingdom, and a whole bunch of those kinds of things on the continent. I have a background in martial arts, so I will also kind of look at elements of Japan and China as well. Less so, though there is a heavy Mongolian influence in a lot of the stuff that I've been doing this year in my personal work, just because that was the world that my patrons voted on. I do a lot of world building on my Patreon, and the patrons voted on which world they wanted to explore of the kind of 5 that I've been messing around with. And the world they picked for this year had a Mongolian-ish tilt to it, but it was more a lot of other cold weather cultures that are pulled from that. And that was another thing. When I was in college, one of the classes I got to take was cultural anthropology. So I pull a lot from that as well.
Well, that kind of leads me a little bit into a pet peeve of mine I've always kind of had about fantasy art. And this is such a nitpicky, stupid thing to get hung up on. but it's always really bugged me that, like, fantasy art, and it's definitely true in Magic, but you see it definitely in TV and movies as well, where you're dealing with, whether it's fantasy or sci-fi, where stylistically everyone tends to look just like whatever's currently cool of the moment. Whether it's everyone's hairstyle is set in the far past or set 10,000 years in the future is the same cool haircut everyone has right now.
Okay.
It is maddening to me when you have like all of human history and all of the limitless imagination at your disposal. You just do whatever the cool thing is right now. Drives me nuts. And is that just because it's a way to make characters look cool by having them look like what we currently conceive of as cool? Is that the main reason for that?
I think that's part of it. I actually have been thinking about that for a while myself, and I don't have a great answer for that. I have a guess. One of my personal thoughts on this is that a part of it has to do with ease, and just, again,
Sure.
Maybe some of that is the, making them look cool to our moment. But I think another part of it is, reference is a thing. We need to be able to work with reference, and sometimes you just are going with the reference you have for whatever model you're working with. But the other thing that I personally think is, I think it is because there has been for so long a male-dominatedness in fantasy, and I feel like a lot of the time men don't pay as much attention to the hair as maybe we should.
Sure.
And because because it's something that we don't always think about, we don't consider how that would change or be different in the societies that we're painting for or that we're dealing with. And sometimes we just don't think to look up reference of, hey, what was the hair in this place and time like? That is one of those things that I think can be a blind spot for artists if it's something that's never been called to our attention before, or if you just have this thing where you have a group that, generally speaking, doesn't care about it. So it's not something that we put too much thought or effort into. But I do understand why that would be, but that would be something that would mess with someone a little bit, because you go with, wait, this is supposed to be a medieval fantasy setting. Why does this person have a modern day fade or whatever?
Well, especially and if you look back at old Magic cards, 20 years ago, the male characters all had the cool 90s goatee.
Oh,
and
right.
Today the male characters all have like the big, kind of hipster beard. Or at least a lot of them do.
Okay.
So yeah, that really is something that always jumps out at me when, especially looking through old cards, you can almost see the progression. If you look back at like old issues of, like, I'm trying to think of the D&D magazines, or even like things like Heavy Metal, in the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone had like giant Farrah Fawcett kind of hair. Then Menno had like the big Fabio hair, the big Heavy Metal hair kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, this is actually one of the things when I used to work in a library, and I would play a game with old books, trying to guess when they were published based on the cover art.
Sure, you bet. Well, I just started watching the TV show Raised by Wolves with my wife, which is a future set sci-fi show. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I kind of like about it is everyone for the most part, has a terrible haircut. There's a bunch of characters that all have just these severe, awful mullets that don't look good on anybody. But at least it's like different. Like they're clearly, it's supposed to be a societal thing there, and it's at least different. And I kind of like that someone made an attempt to give a bunch of characters haircuts that aren't currently cool and of the moment. So I can appreciate that.
All right, I get that.
So what are your feelings towards alters? Now, any particular type that you like or dislike? And would you have problems with people altering an art that you had already made, we'll say if it were on a card, or just your art in general?
So I actually have no problem with card alters. I think they're fascinating. It's not something that I would feel comfortable doing myself, just because alters are typically done traditionally and my traditional skills are a little rusty. But I think that they are really fun, and they can be a great way to show off some different ways of doing things with your art. I don't personally have a problem with that, but I can't speak for every artist out there, obviously. As for if somebody were going to alter something that I had done when I eventually managed to finally get something in with Wizards, card alters are part of the community. If somebody is looking at my stuff and they think that the card that I've done, or they like something about it, because mostly alters I see are kind of more expansions of the art rather than full changes. Like I see a lot of full art alters, I see a lot of extended border alters, which I think is kind of where we got those frames now.
Yep.
I would have no real problem with that, because it's just this idea that people want to see more of a thing, and I'm not really going to be too bothered by other people, wanting to make a minor change or even a major one, because in the event that happens, I still got paid for the job. It's still out there. People can do that. As far as, again, if it's on the cards, I might have an issue if I'm selling, a print or something and somebody wanted to do that. But
sure.
But like the card things, like that's part of the community, and I'm a big part, and I love being part of the Magic community when it's behaving itself. So, so I don't think I'd have a problem with that. I mean, at that point, that's one of those things. That's a problem of success that I hope I get to have one day.
Well, it's this obviously isn't close to the same thing, but like as we've all gotten a little more successful in terms of content creation, 3 years ago, I never would have had somebody say to me, hey, that I made the same deck that you have.
Right.
I just never would have been a thing. And I get that now. Like people will say, hey, I liked that, whatever deck of yours. So I built one that's very, very similar. And at first it was a strange thing, or I didn't know how I felt about it maybe, but after thinking about it, like that's a really, really huge compliment.
Yeah.
And I would feel like there's, I wouldn't attempt to say how people should feel or assume the same, but I would guess as an artist, I can see how plenty of artists would feel the same way. Like you want to take a piece that I did and make it your own to a degree. I feel like if something of yours spoke to somebody enough to do that, I feel like there's a good chance someone would take that as a compliment. So
I know in my case, I would think that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. Right, exactly. That's how I feel when someone does that with the deck here as well. So
I'm actually reading your website right now, and this kind of came out to me, and I was curious about this. So we'll go off of your alters. It wouldn't bother you or anything like that. But why are you not happy with this tuxedo cat that you live with?
I do not get along with cats very well. I don't like animals that I don't like animals that think I'm the servant.
Okay.
which all cats do.
Yes.
Like so like my girlfriend is the one who got the cat, and we had a deal. Because I've lived with cats my entire life and I don't like cats. So I don't understand why they like me.
Like you'd think it would be mutual, but it's not.
It's not.
If anything, you not liking cats is an invitation for them to like you even more.
Oh yeah, happens all the time. And so I've lived with cats my entire life. My mother and my aunt were big cat people, and that's who I grew up with. And so she agreed to 1 year, the first year in our new place, no cat. And then literally she was counting down the days.
Oh boy.
Till we hit the 1 year anniversary, and she got a cat literally like 3 days after the 1 year anniversary.
Oh.
Perfect.
Oh, I had to know. I'm sorry. I was reading through everything on there, and I'm like, that's quite amusing. I need to know about this.
So I guess my question for you is, I've been looking at your website and some of the art you have on there. I'm just wondering, what is your personal preference? Do you like drawing more characters, so whether they're humans or animals, or do you prefer doing the landscapes or like skyline type artwork?
Oh man, that's a tough question, because I've been told, like, I've been really focused on trying to get better at my characters in the last several years, and multiple artists have told me that they felt that I was very good at landscapes, which I never necessarily felt was a specialty or a great strength of mine, but I don't really have a preference in that. I do like showing my environments. Like, I know a lot of artists struggle with their environments and backgrounds, and that's a thing that I've heard people talk about before, but I love doing both because I think both are so important to the storytelling, which is what I really care about, is making sure that a good story gets told.
Gotcha. Well, I have to say the fortress you drew is, I think, my favorite piece on your website.
Nice. I
definitely prefer the skylines and environments over characters.
Yeah, that one is actually kind of fascinating. That one's still getting traction even now because it's a couple of years old, and it's one of the few pieces from that time period that I actually still like. So that feels pretty good to know.
Awesome.
Very cool. Well, Aaron, thanks a lot for coming out here and talking about this. Actually, this was very enlightening for me to learn, particularly about like the magic, the techniques that go into art, that kind of thing, especially. Is really, really fascinating. Despite not being an artist, it's super cool to actually hear somebody talk about the nuts and bolts of doing it. So thanks a lot for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much for inviting me. I had a blast getting to talk about this stuff. I am always down to have more conversations about the tricks that artists use to make their stuff work. So yeah. I always appreciate when people let me ramble on it.
Yeah. So Aaron, any final words for like inspiring artists who could be listening?
Oh, sure. The big thing is I've actually had a couple of people ask me for help or ask me to how they can improve. And one of the things that I would say to a lot of people who are trying to get better is focusing on how fast or how slowly you're growing is actually going to cause you more problems down the line. This is not a pick this up in a month skill. I had been drawing for nearly 23 years before I finally thought I was starting to make something worth actually looking at. It is, I've been drawing since I was 2, and I don't think I was made anything worth really looking at until I was around 25.
Wow.
It is a long road. This is a lifetime process. I typically describe being a fantasy illustrator as climbing this mountain that you will never reach the top of. All of us are on this climb, and there are going to be people who you start this climb with that you will not finish the climb with. There are people who are going to decide this is not for them. There are going to be struggles and all these different things, and you're going to have moments where you feel like you're going up it alone. But you're always going to find other people on that mountain if you are willing to. If you're looking for them, you're going to find other people who are there, and they're going to find people who are dealing with the same things you are. Give yourself permission to struggle. Give yourself permission to not be the best right out of the gate, because this is one of those lifetime building skills. You will be 80 years old, assuming you get there. You will be 80 years old and still going, maybe this time the piece will be exactly what I want. You're never going to get there, and you have to be okay with that. You have to recognize and know that this is a journey of a lifetime of building this particular skill. And you have to find enjoyment in that rather than it being something that intimidates or scares you.
And really, even if you're a listener out there right now, that applies to almost everything. And that's one of the first things I've been asked in the past about people that are like looking to start podcasting or content creation, for any piece of advice. And I've told them basically the same, not as eloquently as you just said it, but like, you have to just do it. And you have to accept that you're never going to, particularly if you're like putting something out there for people to listen to or see, if you are waiting to do that until you hit a point where you love what you're doing, you're going to be waiting forever. Because you're never going to be happy with it, because it's never going to be as good as it could be. You just have to just do it and put it out there and keep working at it.
Yeah, because
you
are your own worst critic.
Absolutely.
Give yourself permission to be bad at a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Give yourself permission
because you got to be bad at it
it
before you can get good at it.
Exactly. You got to fail more times than most people ever try to actually get good at something.
Oh, I failed a lot at a lot of things. I know how that goes.
Yep.
That's a great way to wrap it up. You have to, thanks a lot.
Thank you guys so much for the invite. I look forward to getting some games in with you guys.
Yes,
sure,
thank you.
Sure.
Remind everyone where they can find you here before we cut out.
Sure. You can find me pretty much anywhere. You can search my name, Aaron Radney. That's Aaron. Last name is Radney, Radney. You can find me on the Twitter birds at Aaron_Radney. You can find me at my website, www.aaronradney.com. You can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Aaron Radney.
And you can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDR Central _Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our podcast is edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find him at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week with another show. Thank you again, Aaron Radney, for joining us. And until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
And I'm Aaron.